Well, good morning. My name is Mike Bryan. I'm a volunteer with the Southern Arizona VA in Tucson, Arizona. Today's date is Tuesday, December the 20th, and we're at the home of Gene Santarelli, Air Force officer, retired after
32 years.
32 years. And so we're in his home in Tucson, Arizona. And Gene, why don't you just give me your full name and your birth date?
Sure. It's Eugene David Santarelli. Was born August 14, 1944.
44. Great. Well, let's just jump right in here. What was life like for you and your family, and what was going on significantly then at the time before the military?
Yeah, I grew up in an immigrant family, blue-collar family in Canton, Ohio. Spent most of my life, to that point there, very seldom ever left the town. The Vietnam War was a significant part of what was going on at that time, and I was fairly certain that following school, that I would either be drafted or would have to volunteer to go into the service and serve our country. And that was kind of expected, although few in my family did. That's something that the family instilled in us, is that service, military service, is something that you ought to just expect to do, and they encouraged us to think that way.
Now, what?
And I say us, meaning my brother, older brother, and myself.
Well, that's another story there with your brother Frank. That he went into the military even before you did.
Yes, he did. Yes.
What did he do?
He was attending college, and then dropped out after 2 years, and then went into an Air Force aviation cadet program. Mm-hmm. Tried to be a pilot, was not selected for pilot training because of, I think it was a combination of sitting height and slightly off in eyesight. But he was, they said he was too tall from his waist up to qualify to be in small aircraft. And because of the eyesight thing, he ended up being selected to go into a navigator training program.
Oh, okay. So he was moving up in a career then.
Yes, yeah. And he was moving on, and his story to me was he went through navigator training as an airman basic, because at that time that program combined boot camp or basic training with navigator training. So he said, you go into a program like I did, you're going to have 1 year of boot camp rather than 6 weeks or whatever the services were doing, at that time.
So he offered a couple of different routes.
He did. He had some great advice.
So how did the school play out? Did you graduate then before?
I did. I attended University of Notre Dame and graduated from college in 1966. I went through Air Force ROTC while I was in school at the advice of my older brother. His comment to me was, you're going to end up in Vietnam. You want to be in a foxhole, or do you want to possibly be in the cockpit of an airplane? He says, your choice. You can decide how you want to go to Vietnam.
Well, it sounded like the route to that was, you could do it a number of different ways.
Yeah. There were, at the time that I was in school, you had the academies, which were, a select group of people who got appointments to the academies. ROTC in all the services was a very large program in those days, and it was because of the Vietnam War and the need for officers in all of the services. Mm-hmm. And so if you were in college, that was a way to at least get into the service through, and get your military training while you were in school. The other way is through officer training programs. that you could go into, but you had to apply for those and be selected to go into officer training programs subsequent to college.
So when you went in, you knew you were going to be an officer when you graduated?
That's correct,
Okay.
yeah.
And then at the end of graduation, tell me a little bit about the selection process for pilot training.
That actually occurred while we were in school, is if you went through a physical to determine if physically you were qualified to be a pilot. You know, normal health, and primarily it was eyesight. If you had good eyesight to go into pilot training. And if you then passed the physical examinations, then there were written exams to find out if you had the right skills to become a pilot.
So you were on track to be a pilot from
Yeah,
the
yeah.
time you were in college.
I knew that having gone through that, passed the exam, passed the physical, that I was qualified to go into pilot training after graduation, and that was the track I was on.
What was the draw to be a pilot? There was nothing in your past that would have indicated
No,
that.
no. It was the advice of my brother, older brother again. You know, he was a navigator, you know, and he was in the service, and he kind of explained to me the culture of the United States Air Force. And he said, there are flyers and then there are non-flyers in the Air Force, and of the flyers, there are pilots, navigators, and others that fly. And he says there's kind of a cultural rank structure there, even though there's no difference, may not be any difference in ranks, but he said the pilot is kind of on the highest rung of the ladder, and he said, I'd recommend if you decide you want to do that, you ought to try and be a pilot.
Top among equals.
That's correct, the top. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Okay. So then what came next?
From school, then I went to pilot training in Del Rio, Texas, which was one of the major pilot training bases, and spent a year there learning how to fly and earning my wings as an aviator or a pilot in the Air Force.
What was that like during that training period?
Very intensive. Both academically and in flying, developing the flying skills. It did not come to me easy, but I did fairly well, you know, in picking up the flying skills, and graduated towards the top of my class at the time. And at that time, if I don't remember the exact numbers, but we had about a 50% washout rate in my pilot training class, and that was considered the norm. You would say start with 100 and you may graduate 50. That was considered the norm. And you went through 3 types of airplanes. You flew in a Cessna 172, which the Air Force at the time called a T-41. Prop airplane, and it was basically a screening program to find out if you could pick up flying skills.
Yeah.
And from that, then you went into primary jet training, was in a T-37, another Cessna airplane, but twin engine jet trainer, screeching engines. You would not want to stand around an airplane unless you had ear protection. That airplane.
Is that when you were introduced to this pilot Jim that you were talking about in your story? No.
It's not ringing a bell. Which one?
Okay. Well, that's okay.
No.
So so then you had the phase 2 from the jets.
From there you then went on to advanced jet training in a T-38 Talon, and that was a supersonic airplane that you did one supersonic flight in the trainer, and it was to just say you could go supersonic. It was the most disappointing ride I had, because you have all these ideas about what it is like to fly supersonic, and when you're inside the airplane you don't feel a thing.
Well, that's,
You just watch the needles jump.
but it's a hurdle that you have to jump before you get.
Well, I think it's to convince yourself you can do it, and that there's not a whole lot to it when you're flying, other than you're going really fast.
And you don't have anything to really relate it to in terms of on the ground.
No, particularly when you're at high altitude, and if you're not going by any clouds, there's no sensation whatsoever. And I can remember my experience, or the comment I made to my instructor. I said, "Is that it?" Because all it was watching an altimeter jump, a needle on an altimeter jump, and an airspeed indicator pop through
What
Mach 1.
was the during that training? Is that when you had that flying backwards experience?
That was in the screening program.
That was
Yeah, that was the instructor. Yeah, I believe I can't remember his name. Maybe it was Jim. But he was in his 70s, a World War II veteran, and a superb aviator.
Yeah. Well, the Jim, I'm looking at the book here. It says that was in the F4 training course.
Oh, that was my first aircraft commander.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You wanna-
that's a different experience.
Are we there yet, or is
No. If you want to hear about the flying backwards,
Yeah.
it is.
Because that was early on in your career.
It was one of my first flights, and you're being taught how to fly an airplane. And it was on a typical summer afternoon in Texas where you had thunderstorms were building.
Yeah.
And when you're in a light airplane, you don't want to get too close to them. And if the weather looked too bad, you would be weather recalled. Told basically get a radio call that says, "Come on back and land."
Yeah.
And we got a weather recall, and the instructor, the old instructor, said, "Let me have the airplane, I'm going to show you something." And I went, "Yes, sir." And he took control of the airplane. He said, "You ever flown backwards?" And I said, "We can't do that, can we?"
Flying backwards.
And so he started flying towards the thunderstorm, and figured out by watching the ground and having a sense of what the wind direction was, being able to turn directly into the wind. And when you're flying a Cessna 172, you can slow flight it,
Yeah.
which you practice to do. And so he went into slow flight and got the airplane down to about probably 60 to 70 miles an hour airspeed.
Yeah.
And when you're flying into a wind that's more than 70 miles an hour, he turned to me and said, "Look out the window."
So you're
And when I
flying.
looked out the window, we were going backwards.
Well, if I ever experience that on a commercial flight, I'll know what's going on.
Yeah. Well, that taught me something, and that was a lesson I carried through my entire flying career.
Well, I'm telling you, well then, so you had 3 phases of training then early on.
Yes.
Yeah.
The T-41, which was basic screening, the
Yeah.
initial training, and then into the primary jet training, the first jet trainer, the T-37, and then the T-38 was a supersonic jet trainer.
Okay. And then after the training period, then where did you move up
When
to?
we got our wings as Air Force pilots, we then, part of the school was you could pick, based on your standing in the class, what operational airplane you would like to go to.
Okay.
And based on all the advice of the instructors, they said, "You ought to be a fighter pilot. You don't want to go fly big cargo airplanes." And I went, "Okay, I want to be a fighter pilot."
You were easily convinced.
Yeah. It was because I think most of the instructors who had been to Vietnam already and were now back as a basic pilot instructor, pilot training instructor, several had been through Vietnam, and I was very impressed with all the guys that had come back from Vietnam, and almost every one of them were fighter pilots.
Well, they loved the training probably, just being able to get up in that cockpit and go fast.
Well, they would just soon be back in fighter aircraft, so they grumbled about it, at the time, which that created that aura about being a fighter pilot. I said, if this is something that they're just really can't wait to get back and go do, I said, that sounds like something I think I want to do.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, that makes sense. So during the training then with the F4, you want to talk a little bit about
Yes,
that?
yeah, that was, I selected F4s, and as I think I was the third or fourth highest in the class, and there were, by the time the type of airplane, by the time they got to me, number 4 in picking, F4s were the only fighter available. And at that time, the only way into the F4 was to become a backseat pilot. It's basically a weapons system operator, so you're actually not the primary pilot in the airplane.
And being the primary pilot is what the goal is.
Yes, yeah, so we used to call him the guy up front, the fuff, the fella up front. And I was referred to as the gib, the guy in the back.
There's got to be an acronym for everything, doesn't
That's
there?
true, that's, yeah.
So tell me what, you had this experience, you're talking about being walleye qualified?
This was going through training. You could go through the basic F4 training program, which included a variety of different forms of flying. You learned how to fly air combat. You learned how to drop bombs, fly air to ground. You learned low-level flying. You went through different phases of the program so that when you got out of the F4, you were combat qualified pilot.
To do a lot of different kinds of missions.
That's correct. At the end of that completed F4 training program, at the time they had a special weapons training program for a select few people, and I was picked to become one of the pilots to train on what was considered a new innovative weapon at the time, and that was a TV guided bomb. It was electro-optic. It had an electro-optical sensor in the front, and you basically could in the cockpit you could get actually the image, a TV image of what the bomb was looking at, and you could actually guide the bomb by steering it, because it through signals you could actually steer the bomb down to a quote-unquote pinpoint hit, which was very different than just dropping bombs, gravity bombs. Because depending on the altitude, then it's wind and a whole bunch of errors that, it's just whatever the bomb does after you release it.
It's a lot less precise than
Yes,
when you
yeah,
had
it was one of the early versions of a precision weapon.
Nice.
It was an electro-optical precision weapon. Laser-guided bombs were still in development, but had really not become operational at that point.
So things are going to be getting even better as you move forward.
Yes.
And then it says you were paired with a front seat pilot, Jim, who had just returned from an 8-month assignment
In Vietnam.
In Vietnam.
Actually, he had been in Thailand and was actually at the base that I ended up going to. And it's once again, somebody ahead of you says, you're going to have to go to Vietnam. Here are the bases that I'd recommend you try and get to. And you could put in a request. You didn't know whether you're going to get there or not. But he highly recommended going to Ubon, Thailand, which is what I asked for and eventually got.
Mm-hmm. And then, but he was having problems flying at night, then I guess.
Yes, yeah. Probably one of the more significant things that happened is when, toward the end of the F4 training program, when you go into night gunnery, you basically go to the bombing range at night, and you're doing dive bombing at night. Jim was very uncomfortable flying at night, and he was professional enough that he and I talked about that. And he said, you need to work the weapon systems in the back. But if ever you feel like you're uncomfortable with what you're doing or you think something is wrong, don't be afraid to speak up. And on our very first gunnery mission on the range, we were going into the gunnery pattern
At night.
at night. Everything had been good up to that point, but I could tell Jim was apprehensive, because he didn't like flying at night. He'd had bad experiences in the past, I guess, flying at night. And got vertigo on the very first pass that we rolled in on. And I could tell just by the way the airplane was going that he basically had lost control of the airplane. And when I called to him over the intercom and didn't get a response, I took control of the airplane and pulled it out of a dive. And I pulled so hard that I popped the on-off button on the radios off. And climbed back up to altitude above everybody else, and we just began to orbit or set up a circle over the range. And Jim got his senses back, and he took control of the airplane again. I gave it back to him. And he said, we'll just stay up here, but he says, something's not right. It's awful quiet. And then I started looking around and I realized what I had done, and I went, oh, it's the radio. And I hit the on-off button back on just in time to hear a radio call from the instructor who was leading the flight saying, has anybody seen the fireball yet? Well, that leaves an impression on you, because Jim and I knew they were talking about us because they had lost contact, in trying to track everybody. When you're in a gunnery pattern at night, you look for lights. Well, they lost sight of us because we had, after that maneuver, had climbed above them and nobody was looking above them to find us. And so they were convinced that we had crashed. And so it was very sheepishly, we came back on the radio and said, we're number 2, I think we're number 2. We're high and dry or above everybody, flying in circles over the range. Well, the radios went silent. The instructor didn't know what to say for about 30 seconds. And then he came back and said, number 2, go home. We'll talk to you at home. So we flew back home by ourselves.
Say, I'm out of here.
Yeah, that's right.
So what happened when you got back? I mean, was there, well, it would have been a deep briefing.
We landed, went into the squadron, explained to the duty officer, who was the number 2 man in the squadron, what had happened. And he said, okay, you just take off your gear and we'll talk to you later. Just go into a briefing room and stay there.
Just go away and have some coffee.
That's right. Yeah. That's exactly right. And what happened is my front seater was removed from the program. I was grounded for 3 days until they went through an investigation of everything that happened, and I went through a series of interviews, and then was put back into the program to complete it.
You said you never saw Jim after that much.
I did not. No.
So when with that kind of an experience, I mean, that's got to be an eye opener. I mean, was there a change in the way you were flying because of maybe the realization that it could go bad real quick?
It was a great lesson learned. And night flying is a difficult mission. Is that I went, well, okay, maybe I will or will not like to fly at night.
Yeah.
But I found out I became kind of, after that I gained a lot of confidence and became comfortable at night, and it was just, odd that I get to Ubon, Thailand, and the squadron I'm assigned to is the night fighting squadron.
Talk to the night owls.
Yeah, the night owls, that's right. And I said, must have been meant to be, must have been meant to be. But I never expected that because of that specialized training that I had gone through after the normal F4 training program.
Because you can't guide a TV.
No,
bomb
it was a
at night.
day-only weapon. When I went through that walleye training, walleye was the name of the weapon. When I went through that training, I thought almost certainly that I would end up in a squadron that maintained crews with those special skills. By the time I got to Ubon, though, the base, even though they were the one base that had the weapon, they weren't using the weapon anymore because the missions didn't call for that type of a weapon. And everybody kind of forgot about it. It was in my records that I went through this training and they shipped me off to the night squadron.
Talk a little bit about night flying and you know, some of the experiences that you had when you were, because you had how many missions?
In that first tour, I did 2 combat tours in the same squadron. In that first tour, I probably had close to 200 missions, which was more than normal, but I made myself available to fly because there wasn't much else to do.
So you had what, like 2 in the end?
I did 2 one-year tours in Vietnam.
Back to back.
One in the back seat. And coming back from that tour, if you wanted to get to the front seat of the F4 to become a FUF, an aircraft commander, you had to volunteer to go back to Vietnam.
Okay.
And it just so happened when I was completing that second tour, is even though prior to that, people who had already been to Vietnam once were not going back, is the Air Force had gone through pretty much every one of the pilots they were going to send to Vietnam, and so they started sending people back. And we were told, you volunteered to go back, you're going back. And so I ended up doing back-to-back tours with about a 7-month training period in between.
But when you went back, you were a guy in front.
That's right. I was an aircraft commander.
Okay. Was that much different?
It was.
How so?
Yeah. Combat experience. And that was one of the lessons from my first tour to my second tour. And the story I wrote in the book was really about my first tour. When I got there on that first tour as a guy in the back, a weapons system officer, most of the front seat F4 pilots were not fighter pilots. They had gone through career in airlift airplanes or bombers. There were a few seasoned fighter pilots in the squadron, but most were people meeting, getting their combat tour. And the opportunity to get a combat tour at that time, because the F4 was the primary fighter in the Air Force at the time, was to go to combat in the F4. And so I flew with people who predominantly did not have lots of experience in fighters. They had lots of experience as a pilot, but not lots of experience as a fighter pilot. And that was interesting, particularly when you're in night combat, in a night squadron.
I want to hear more about the night flying and some of your experiences with that. But before we do that, when you have a tour of Vietnam and then you come home for 7 months and then you go back, I mean, the mood of the country is not very supportive at that time.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah.
No.
Did that have any effect on what you were trying to do, or did you feel like you were still...
Actually, no. I think doing back-to-back tours is you didn't see a lot of that, because my first tour was 68 to 69. And the mood of the country was really changing in that 68, 69 timeframe. You know, Tet was during my first combat tour, and I flew in that operation. And so you saw a little bit of it in that 7 months in between tours, but when it really started to get bad in the country, I was back in combat. You know, almost protected. I was doing something that I was comfortable with because I just spent a year doing it.
Yeah.
And in that second tour, what was surprising is the whole complexion of the squadrons changed. Where I told you in that first tour, there were these older, seasoned, non-fighter pilots who tended to be in the aircraft commanders in the F-4.
Yeah.
When I went back on the second tour, we all looked like me. A majority of the squadrons were young captains on their second combat tour. And it was amazing the difference in performance. It was almost like all of us said, we've been here before, we understand this, we know what we have to watch out for.
So there was more confidence in the experience.
There was, and there was lower loss rates. One of my very first experiences, or something that I talked about from that first tour, is I go into the squadron, we're a night fighter squadron, and I lost 9 buddies. But being a young lieutenant, I went, I guess that's normal. You know, when we went back on my second tour, we only lost 1 in our squadron.
Even though you're flying as much.
Even though, yeah, same type of mission, we're flying just as much, we're flying similar combat missions, and the loss rates were significantly less. I credited that to experience. The fact that we had all been, or most of us, had already had a year plus worth of combat experience, and we understood what we were getting into.
Now, the 9 guys that you lost, were they POWs eventually, or were they shot down?
No. Every one of them died either in crashes, and there was one case where one was actually killed after he was on the ground waiting for the rescue. That's a report we got back. Yeah. But most of them, when you're flying at night, most of the losses were not due to enemy fire. It's people would fly into the ground, hit a mountain. Mm-hmm. You know, because we did not have the sophisticated systems
that were coming later.
Yeah, that came later. Now, we had a number of them that were actually shot out of the sky. You know, and they're all sad. Every one of them are sad. But you know, when you're in a night combat squadron, you tend to expect higher loss rates. And I think that, you know, that's the thing, the impression, you know, as a young lieutenant, I said, well, you know, that was my norm until I learned that was not the norm. That is not normal.
It was not necessary either. Mm-hmm. And talk a little bit about, you were saying in your story there about night flying and the different tactics that you would use to try to get to either, you know, moving targets.
Yeah. We had a couple of different missions we flew. On that first tour, most of our work was interdiction. We were trying to stop the flow of supplies coming from North Vietnam down into South Vietnam. And we did that both in North Vietnam, in the southern part of North Vietnam. The Air Force had what was called Route Package 1, which is basically from the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, up about 60 to 80 miles into North Vietnam. And then the country, North Vietnam was divided into 6 sectors, 6 route packages is what we call. We predominantly flew in that southern one, so it was if supplies coming from Hanoi and Haiphong or from the north were flowing down through North Vietnam, they were either coming through that route package 1, which was the last time they were in North Vietnam, and then they were going to be, they're going to be actually moving supplies in South Vietnam, or they were coming through Laos on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And at that time, we didn't talk a whole lot about the air war in Laos, but I flew an awful lot of missions up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And what we would try and do is develop known choke points where we would try and navigate to those points through any number of ways, primarily through our internal navigation system, inertial navigation system, which was not very accurate. And then we would use flares to light up the ground and try and figure out where we were based on known checkpoints and what we thought those known checkpoints, or learned what those known checkpoints looked like, and then would dead reckon from those checkpoints where we thought our target was. So I would call that, and we did that in Laos, and we did that predominantly on the interdiction missions in North Vietnam, and that was most of the missions I flew on that first tour.
Because you were saying in your story that that system would really only get you within, what, 5 miles or so?
About 5 miles, and then we had we had some weapons release computers that we could tie into it and try and get a little more accurate, or from suspected points get somewhat accurate navigation to where we thought our targets were. I referred to in my book or my chapter, is that was scientific floundering around.
There's got to be an acronym for that too.
Yeah, I never invented one, but it's when you know you can get within about 5 miles or where you think you should be, but you're still depending on trying to visually identify something, and then from there work your way either up and down a road, or following other indicators to where you thought your target was, or where you thought the enemy supplies were, or where the trucks were. By the time I was there was little train traffic moving stuff. It was predominantly trucks, bicycles, and human caravans. But we were primarily going after truck convoys.
The flares, once you shot those things off, they would know your position, right?
Oh yes, yeah.
So
that usually attracted gunfire. But and frequently, the gunners would just be shooting at noise too. And in fact, one of our tactics was fly to the gunfire.
Okay.
Which is not a smart thing to do when they're shooting at you. But we knew if they were shooting at us, there was something on the ground they were trying to protect.
Because they wouldn't be there otherwise.
That is usually the case. Now, sometimes they would set up what we called flak traps, where they would try and lure us. They would try and put dead trucks out on the road. Trucks that had already been hit. To try and attract us to an area where they had just loaded up all their anti-aircraft guns and just trying to shoot down an aircraft. And they would do that during the day as well as at night.
What about the difference of flying with a full moon versus when it's just pitch black?
It's similar to here in Tucson. Full moon is almost like flying during the day, particularly over there, because there's no ambient light on the ground. It is,
rural.
It's rural. That's right. And in the moon, you could actually see the terrain. and pick out features when you had a full moon, or at least when you had a relatively good moon phase. When you were in the no moon phase, it was black. It was very disorienting and very, very dark.
You can see those tracers pretty well.
And you depending on what you were doing, you kind of favored one versus the other. You figured if I can't see them, I know they can't see me. So they are definitely just shooting at sound.
And sometimes they hit.
Yeah. But as soon as you'd pop out a flare on a real dark night, that got to be disorienting, and you had to learn how to deal with that. Yeah. And the last thing you ever wanted to do was fly under a flare, because then you could be seen.
Yeah, there are do's and don'ts.
Yeah.
Well then, are there other things in Vietnam, guys that you were with, that you'd like to remember?
Oh, I'm trying to think. There is a whole group of characters, and that's the one thing that you remember the most. I may not remember the names now, but the people are what made the combat tour worthwhile. You would put your life on the line for them. They would do the same thing for you, and that's that camaraderie you develop in combat. It's almost like a super fraternity. I never belonged to a fraternity. I'll listen to people talk about their frat brothers, but that combat experience it was like a super fraternity.
It is a brotherhood.
Yes, it is.
And then later on, you were, I'm going back to the story here now.
Sure.
I'm trying to make the connection between the beginning of the story when you were first there, and then when you were flying in Germany, where you were flying the F-16 on a training mission, trying to shoot a bridge.
Sure, yeah, I could be more than happy to walk you through that story as I remember it vividly to this day.
Love to hear it.
Oh, I'm drawing a blank on the day.
Was it July? Or June?
July, Alan Shepard set foot on the moon. July.
Neil Armstrong?
Or Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong.
July 22nd.
Yes.
1969.
Yeah. Life in a night flying squadron is the room that you're living in is in a wooden structured building we called a hooch, and it'd be like a dorm room in a college, and you had a roommate, and usually the two of you were on a similar schedule or slightly off, but you're flying at night, so your room is blacked out, so you can sleep during the day. And on that day, like many, I'd awake late morning, because normally we finished our flying somewhere between midnight and 3 or 4 in the morning, and we'd tend to go to the club, go to the officers' club, and have a few drinks with our buddies, and then go back to the queue to get some sleep, so we get up, start the routine all over again, go down and prepare for your mission, and get ready to go fly again. I woke up that morning, my roommate was still sleeping, and so I wanted to slip out of the room and be as quiet as I could, and I was just going to go sit on the front porch of our hooch, and just wake up. And normally the tradition was take your little transistor radio so you could listen to Armed Forces Network, AFN radio. And on that day, the news was talking about Neil Armstrong. We had just landed a man on the moon. And that got all lost in when you're flying combat. You're not tracking that as closely as the rest of the world is. And when I turned the radio on, I'm listening to the newscaster talking about we now have 2 Americans on the moon. I went, oh, this is that special day. And then they play a recording of Neil Armstrong's word, that one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And I'm listening, sitting there with my sunglasses on, staring into the sun, listening to this news broadcast and listening to Neil Armstrong talk. And the only thought that crosses my mind is he's how many hundreds of thousands of miles away, and his voice is as clear as a bell. And I went, why can't we have radios like that in RF4?
I can't even hear from the
Yeah,
front
because
to the back.
normally if I've got a wingman who, depending on the weather, is a mile away and it's nothing but static, we would have that kind of problems. And that's, and so that's how you translate significant events into your world at the time. And then I can remember, listening to a little more of the newscast and saying, oh, I've got to go to work. I wonder what this all means. That was a thought in my mind at the time. And I will tell you, I made speeches about this later on in my career. But, I really did. I said, I wonder what this all means. And then you get back into your world and you say, I've got to go down to the squadron and get ready to fly another combat mission tonight. I was coming to the end of my tour. I said, I'd already knew that I had been selected to upgrade to go to the front seat. Did not know that I was going to end up coming back to Vietnam, or to Thailand. So I thought, this is pretty good. All I need to do is stay alive, get home, and do my job, get home.
Success is easy to define, isn't it?
It is. When you're in combat, it's do your job, stay alive, get home. Go from day to day. And, life is pretty simple when you break it down into chunks like that.
Clarity.
Yeah, and it is. It's very clear. It's very, very clear. And that, and so when you have these big events, you say, oh, I'll think about that over a whiskey tonight or next week or whenever, but I've got a job to do. I got to go do my job. And I knew if I'm doing my job, there was somebody on the other side who was going to try and prevent me from doing my job. So I said, that's that, stay alive, survive, get your job done.
And then 25 years later, you're in Germany flying an F-16.
Fast forward.
Yeah. And you're going through a
I was
flying drill.
a regional commander in Germany. I'm a 2-star general at the time. I pretty much was responsible for Air Force operations south of the English Channel, north of the Alps. At that time, part of that job was to fly with units that were under my command, and I was current in the F-16 frontline fighter at that time, still is today. And was flying with the 52nd TAC Fighter Wing at Spangdahlem Air Base, Germany, on a training mission. And our training mission was interdiction, a simulated interdiction mission where we were going to practice as a 2-ship how we would fly into Eastern Europe and go after a fixed target, like a bridge. And we had we found along in a low-level training area, a small bridge that we said, that's going to be our simulated target, and we're going to practice flying about a 20 or 30 minute low level at 500 feet to navigate to that target and then go through a simulated bomb run on that target. The F-16 at that time, similar to my old F-4, had an inertial navigation system. Unlike my old F-4, we now have satellites overhead called Global Positioning System. And it's integrated into that inertial navigation system, constantly updating it. So it's an accurate navigation system. to where my trusty F4 used to get me to around 5 miles of my target. This had advertised accuracy to 50 meters to 100 meters of the target. That is a significant difference. So we go out, we brief, prepare for the mission, we fly our low level, and I can remember we're running in on our target run, and I am a wingman, so I move into my attack position and set everything up. And all I'm doing is I'm watching my leader and following the needles, following the navigation direction. And I go into a pop-up, which is a climbing maneuver from a low level, into my normal dive bomb or bombing pass, following the needles, and I roll out with the arrow pointing straight ahead, and there is a little pipper, which is a bombing aiming point device, in my heads-up display, is sitting right over the bridge. You know, practice the release of the weapon. We egress the area, and the flight lead says, okay, let's reset up, do it again. And we did that about 3 more times, you know, and we go through and we practice the events. I said, this was fun. It was a good training mission. And then going back to Spangdahlem. And for some reason, I have no idea, the July in Vietnam pops up again. And I'm going, this is what it's all about. Technology has moved us so far ahead. And you know, and I never realized it. I was flying frontline technology in 1968, and now here I am in 1994 flying frontline technology, and had a vivid demonstration of what the difference is, what American technology had done just for an aviator, combat aviator.
That's awesome.
And I went, you know, and that has stuck with me to this day. I went, bingo. That's what one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind meant. Not only clear radios because I could talk to other people, but it gave us a lot of other things.
Well, the fact somebody pointed out that the smartphone has more technology than the whole Apollo 11
Yes.
effort, you know, and you hold it in the palm of your hand or carry it in your pocket.
I can remember coming out of the F4. My very first assignment in Germany was in 1976, and we converted from F4s to F-15 Eagles. Mm-hmm. And we had a mighty central computer that had 72 kilobytes of storage. We thought we were somebody because of all the magic in the airplane, and today we talk about terabytes of storage or gigabytes of storage. You know, it's just that's what I mean by this is what it was all about.
We'll talk a little bit about on the personal side of why we just covered 25 years pretty quickly there in terms of technology advancement and that sort of thing too. But what about say like what was your life like during that 25 years?
Coming out of Vietnam, I didn't know whether I was going to stay in the Air Force or not. I had an initial 5-year commitment, but based on training in different airplanes, each airplane incurred a little bit more commitment to it. And so I was in the Air Force about 7.5 years before I had the first opportunity to get out of the Air Force. And I thought about going to the airlines at the time. I was lucky enough to have some good bosses and mentors. And the one at that time said, give some serious thought to what you want to do. If you decide, you know, you want to go to the airlines, so be it. He said, are you enjoying what you're doing right now? Do you feel like you're doing something worthwhile? Mm-hmm. And I did. And I applied that rule every time after that for probably 32 years. I enjoyed, every time it came time to, is it time to get out or is it time to retire? Are you enjoying what you're doing? Do you think you're doing something productive? I said, I think I'll just stay around. And when I got to 32 years, I said, it's time to step aside and let somebody else have an opportunity. You've had wonderful opportunities for 32 years. It's time to move on.
What about family? Do you miss them when you were out?
Oh yes. Oh, when there were a lot of temporary duty jobs and remote assignments where you'd leave the family, you'd leave your family behind. It takes an understanding wife when you say goodbye as frequently as I think about. I had to say goodbye for whether it be either 2 weeks at a time, 2 months at a time, or 6 months at a time, or a year at a time. And I've been blessed to have one that understood and, been with me for 40 years.
I think she's going to stay.
Yeah, hopefully.
Are there experiences that come to mind now that we haven't talked about that you'd kind of like to capture?
Oh, there are so many. I wouldn't know where to start. I'll come back to a comment I made before. When I look back on it, those 32 years on active duty, it's the people. Some of our closest friends today came from those military assignments. The people that you have stayed in contact with, and the really close friendships. And it's the common experiences you have. Most all of them are aviators. There are some that are not, but it's like this group that you're interviewing, the Friday pilots. Is it talk about a wonderful group of gentlemen, and most of them I didn't meet until I'd retired, and somebody said, "Do you want to go to lunch with some other, group of other pilots?" And we find out we do that every Friday, as you well know, and it's the stories and the common bond that you have, and the laughs. There are a lot of laughs when you get in with a group that has gone through it.
There's kind of an underlying emotional connection, I think, with people that have those same kinds of experiences under pressure.
They do. There are, and I can relate it back to some experiences in my senior military career in dealing with other countries or air forces from other countries. Pilots talk the same. We may not understand one another,
but you do.
But we do. We do. We start waving hands at one another, and there is an immediate common bond because it's those same experiences that you have. And I can remember getting into a conversation with a Pakistani pilot. And he just representative of others. And, he spoke a little bit of English. I spoke zero Pakistani. But we carried on a conversation for the whole night as if we knew one another as well as you and I talking to one another now. Because we were talking about flying, and there were the same common experiences you had, regardless of what airplane you flew or whatever.
The mentoring program that you're in, or were in, I don't know if you're still in it or not, but what's the importance of mentoring?
It's passing on what you can to those behind you. I equated it to why teachers teach. You develop, this passion for passing knowledge on to others. With mentoring, you're dealing with people who they maybe not be your equals, they're just slightly behind you and you really want to pass on to them the things that you thought you did right, but more importantly, the things you know you did wrong. You know, and
Fess up.
That's right. Mentoring is being very open with someone who is coming into a professional position that you may have been in, and you have some things to pass on to them and say, and it's usually, let me tell you a story. Here's what I did. You probably don't want to do it this way. And I found myself, I said, it was a wonderful job because the things that you couldn't talk about when you were going through it for fear that somebody would say, boy, is this the guy we want in this job? You could openly talk about it as a mentor.
Yeah, and we're expected to.
And I will tell you, the mentee, the person you're working with, appreciated that. They appreciate that honesty and straightforward. And that was, to me, that was the real satisfaction in being a mentor. And I worked with operational commanders, men and women who were going to go out and plan air wars. That's what I did. And there's a lot to learn when you start talking about trying to design and plan something like an Iraqi freedom or a desert storm or whatever it might be.
If you had a class of, say, high school graduates or college graduates, would you recommend the military?
Absolutely. Yeah, sure would. No, it's not meant for everybody. It's a disciplined life. It truly is a way of life. It is not a job. It's not a career, even though we call it a career. But the military is truly a way of life. But it's so rewarding. At least it was for me.
Yeah.
I found it to be very, very rewarding.
Okay. Are there other events or people that we want to mention, or is it? I've kind of run out of questions.
I'm trying to think of the only group of people that I think that I would mention is I was blessed to have good bosses who were mentors, most every step of the way. Doesn't happen all the time, but when I think back of moving through a 32-year Air Force career, and the stories that come to mind is the advice that I got from the people that I work for, and I was blessed to have very good ones.
Fabulous. That might be a good spot to wrap up.
Yeah.
I do want to thank you for sharing your story.
Oh, happy to do it.
Okay.